We are here at the B20 Summit on day two, and joining me, I'd like to welcome Deidre Penfold. She's the Executive Director for the Chemicals and Allied Industry Association. Deidre, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Deidre, talk to us about where chemicals are now within a economy, within a world where the move to the just transition, green energy, seems to be lifting off faster than we had expected.
Yes, absolutely. So I think in South Africa, one of the negatives around South Africa is that we are losing many of our companies. They are going overseas and actually investing there. But we do have a plan for that in South Africa. I think for the chemical industry, it's important that we start looking at the greener side of things. It can be more costly, but it is, from a health point of view, something that we need to look at. So we at the Chemical and Allied Industries Association have what we call a program called Responsible Care, and that is in about 70 countries throughout the world. So it's over and above being reliant on the legislation and that we have in the country. It's over and above that. So for us, it's important that we then move on to greener pastures, if I could put it that way. And in particular around some of the multilateral engagements that we have, like the Plastics Treaty, for example, that we're part of, we're seeing that we're needing to move in that greener space. And companies are doing that. One of the other things around the just transition is to actually be transparent as well about what is in a product, what chemicals there are. And we also talk about the transportation and how those are transported. So the green side, in particular with many of the multinationals and many of our companies in South Africa, the greener agenda is being looked at in sincerity to ensure that it is a cleaner environment for us from a chemical perspective.
Deidre, fossil fuels, right? When we talk about that from a G20 supposed leadership agreement, there's a consensus that from an economic perspective, the move to the green energy seems to be the unilateral way going forward. How has, from a chemicals perspective, that move, or is there still a plan to move to that, going to happen? Because ultimately, as we move forward in the 21st century, this discussion on green energy becomes more and more louder.
Yes, it does. I think in South Africa, though, we are still very reliant on the coal and fossil fuels. And we need to move away. The companies, in particular, some of our members are starting to move away, but it's not something that can happen overnight. And internationally, if we actually have a look, some of the countries are still going back to coal again, just given that we have the abundance. But it's how we actually process that coal is important for us in terms of greening the climate area and moving away from fossil fuels.
Deidre, when we speak of chemicals, it's obviously a lot of the clothes that we are wearing, both you and I, the bandage over here, plastic, and so much more. And of course, the leading chemical or petrochemical company here within South Africa is, of course, Sasol. Their discussions in terms of its movement into green energy, it's not a quick fix or it's not a quick movement because, as you've mentioned, there are communities which, of course, are still fossil fuels based. And when I mean that, their income, the survival of the community depends on fossil fuels. How easy or difficult is that transition going to be in order to make sure that, number one, if that transition's happening, it does not happen at the expense of the communities that survive on that industry?
Yeah, I think Cecil has got, and I know Simon Baloy has set that out very clearly as to what they are going to be doing. And you're right, it must not be at the expense of the community. But as I said earlier, it's not a quick fix. So I think those are the areas that are being looked at to ensure that the transition is smooth, but it's certainly not going to happen overnight. And just talking around the various sectors, we believe and know that chemicals are in everything. So any sector that we have in the country and an economy has a chemical somewhere. So without chemicals, we don't have an economy.
Deidre, a lot of the criticism on chemicals, or as I would put it in the words of Greenpeace, disruption to nature, has been, of course, been louder. From your perspective, from the organization that you represent, how do you respond to that? Because obviously their call is fossil fuels needs to be phased out completely. Now, in this conversation, we've been saying it's not just an easy fix. So how does that happen amidst the criticism that is coming from these nature-based organizations like Greenpeace and any other climate organizations or climate activists in that matter?
I think we've got to look at the economics about it. And we obviously engage with the NGOs as well. But I think that sometimes the comments that are made by them are not substantiated with fact. Yes, chemicals are dangerous. We know that. There are some that are more hazardous than others. And when I spoke about our program called Responsible Care, that's where we come in. So it's the way you dispose of the chemicals. And it also, you've got to be responsible in doing that. So some of it does land up in the rivers or in the seas or whatever the case is. But I think without that, we wouldn't actually have an economy. So, I think there's got to be a balance in terms of how we use those chemicals. And the companies do take responsibility for managing it in a responsible manner. Again, fossil fuels is not going to disappear overnight in South Africa. Definitely not. It's going to take longer, but they're doing it in a responsible manner.
One final question, Deidre. With South Africa's G20 presidency wrapping up, the uniformity for green energy, and of course the transition for those who are still fossil fuel based, has there been a timeline that has been set in terms of how this is going to happen? Now, bear in mind, United States of America takes over the presidency, and the rhetoric coming out of Washington is fossil fuels must remain. It's a head scratcher, isn't it, at this moment?
Yeah. Look, I think there are a lot of discussion around the G20 and in particular the B20 around energy and the transition to cleaner energy, etc. But we are still well endowed with coal here from a fossil fuel point of view. So, it cannot be wished away. I think a lot has transpired through the B20 and the G20. It'll be interesting to see what happens the weekend. But I think you've just got to balance and see how we can do, and as you say, not to the expense of the community. So it's going to be a long road. There isn't a timeline yet, that I can assure you. But the discussions are robust and engaging as well.
Deidre Penfold, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.